Enneagram 5. This is a talk that's going to break a lot of ego investments because most people identify the very idea of intellectualism with the Enneagram 5, when in fact there are many, many types that you can associate with intellectualism, such as the social 2, the social 7, the social 6, even the social 4 to some degree, and most definitely yours truly, the social 1. However, Enneagram 5 does itself, I will admit, have a high capacity for intellectualism, and the social 5 especially being arguably the most intellectual of the types, right up there with social 7 and social 6. But there's way more to the Enneagram 5 than that. And the first thing we have to start with is their pathology, their neuroses. They have a pathological detachment issue. And I would like to mention that their very special brand of detachment has to do with fear, of course, head triad. They are afraid of losing their energy. So let's take a look at what it says here in Claudio Naranjo's Character and Neurosis. If the gesture of anger is to run over, that of avarice, which is their sin, is one of holding back and holding in. While anger expresses greed in an assertive way, the greed in avarice manifests only through retentiveness. It is a fearful grasping, implying the fantasy that letting go would result in catastrophic depletion. So what are we looking at here? The Enneagram 5 is a character that is highly aware of its own lack. So every character at the bottom of the Enneagram, 4, 5, 6, and you could say 3 to some degree, although it's less obvious in the 3, they have an increased awareness of their lack. 5 and 4 are the most like this. With the 4, it's a sense that they're not what they could be, not what they should be. With the 5, it's that they don't have enough. Enough what? Time, energy, resources, emotionality, any sort of thing. And that, again, to quote from here, the belief that letting go would result in catastrophic depletion. Behind the hoarding impulse, there is an experience of impending impoverishment. Let me go ahead and share my screen right here. Give you guys something to look at. Now, he does make a comparison between the Enneagram 1 and the Enneagram 5, but one of the contrasts he makes is that the 1 is characteristically over-extroverted. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are talkative and in the external world as a socially active creature. More so, it is that they are just involved in the external world. And he contrasts this against the 5, where the 5 is actually overly involved in the internal world. They are not interested in making sure that things on the outside are oh so right, oh so perfect. In fact, they have, and this is something that is vital to the 5, a tendency to give up too easily. Because of an excessive resignation in regard to love and people, there is a compensatory clutching at oneself, which may or may not manifest in a grasping onto possessions, but it involves a more generalized hold on the inner life, the economy of effort and resources. So this is a character who, like the 1, is very self-controlled, but where the 1 is self-controlled because he wants to be perfect and to perfect the world, the 5 is self-controlled because if he is not, he fantasizes that he will lose everything, which is of course his cognitive bias, his delusion. Just as it can be said of the wrathful, the Enneagram 1, that they're mostly unconscious of their anger and that anger is their main taboo, it can be said of the avaricious that their avarice is mostly unconscious. While consciously they may feel every gesture of possession and drawing up of boundaries as forbidden. It might be said that the avaricious is internally perfectionistic rather than critical of the outer world. Again, big difference between the Enneagram 5 and the Enneagram 1. Both of them actually have a very strong superego, a very strong sense of what they should do, what they must do. However, the biggest contrast between 1 and 5 here, again, is that the 5 feels that he is a failure to his superego, and the 1 feels as though he is a success to it. So, while the 5 and the 1 both have a strong sense of should and must, The 5 feels that he simply doesn't measure up, and the 1 can't help but feel that he is the measure that others must measure up to. 1 is arrogance, 1 is false self-hatred. Now, another useful contrast, again, between the 1 and the 5, is that the 5 seeks to minimize their own needs and claims, where the 1 is actually very demanding. The 5 is prone to be pushed around in virtue of a compulsive obedience, which I suspect is a result of them having such a strong superego. Their compulsive obedience is not so that they can continue to fulfill their own positive self-image, because they don't really have that, but rather to not be entrenched in that feeling of failure. Though both types are characterized by a strong superego, they are like cops and robbers respectively. 5 identifies with the robber, 1 identifies with the cop. The polarity between pathological detachment and the attachment of holding on echoes the polarity of 1 between anger and an over-civilized compulsive virtue. Neediness in the 5 is deeply hidden behind a veil of indifference, resignation, stoic renunciation. And just as perfectionism nurtures the anger that sustains it, we may also say that the prohibition of needs must contribute to the impoverishment of life that underlies the urge to hold on. Let me explain what that means. So while the 1 is perfectionistic, he comes into the world. He sees that the world does not match up to his perfectionism, which causes him to be resentful and angry and active in the world. However, you can't fundamentally change reality. It will always be disappointing and imperfect. This fuels his perfectionism and his anger further in a vicious cycle. We look at the 5. The 5 has a resignation before life, but those who are resigned in life will end up being poor, because the only way to be rich, to be fulfilled, to be happy, is to involve yourself in life. But because the 5 doesn't do that, he ends up being impoverished, which leads him to resign more, which leads him to be impoverished even more. Another vicious cycle. Now, we're going to skip past this section because it is not only a lot of reading, but it's technically not entirely relevant to the character itself. However, I will copy-paste this in the chat so that you fine fellows can read it at any time you want. We're going to scroll on down to what I think is the most important, which is, here we are, the trait structure of the Enneagram 5. We're only going to look at a couple of these because it only takes a couple to be able to put the rest into place. This is a retentive character, which in my opinion it's the main thing for them. Among the characteristics of retentiveness, it is important to take note of a holding on to the ongoing content of the mind, as if wanting to elaborate or extract the last drop of significance, a characteristic that results in a typical jerkiness of mental function, a subtle form of rigidity that militates against the individual's openness to environmental stimulation, and to what is emerging, the transition of the present mental state to the next. So these people tend to get mentally stuck. Again, this is a mental character. He feels the poorness of his spirit. He does not want to be involved in the real life, very resigned. So what do you do if you're so resigned, so reserved, and so held back? You're going to go into your head, and you're going to get stuck on issues. You are going to mentally extract every drop of significance you possibly can from wherever your mind gets stuck. Because of their retentiveness, they end up being an ungiving, ungenerous character. This is how I know that certain people in this server, I'm not going to give spoilers, certain people on this server, they're not 5s, actually. A lot of self-identified 5s are 6s, actually. And you can tell. 5s are not generally giving people. The avoidance of commitment can be considered as an expression of not giving, since it amounts to an avoidance of giving in the future. In this avoidance of commitment, there is also another aspect. The need of the 5 to be completely free, unbound, unobstructed, in possession of the fullness of themselves. A trait representing a composite avarice and an oversensitivity to engulfment. These people feel overwhelmed easily. They feel that they are too committed, and so they end up being ungiving. This ties into their pathological detachment. And I posted this screenshot earlier in the general chat. It talks about how they have to distance themselves from others and their needs or wants. Why is this? Well, it says here that given the reciprocity of giving and taking in human relationships, a compulsion to not give can hardly be sustained except at the expense of the relationship itself. So when it comes to maintaining the relationship or giving, they'll choose to be detached. They are so entrenched in their retentiveness that relationships can often be lost because of exhaustion. Fastest way to lose an Enneagram 5? Be exhausting. Be a lot to deal with, and they will boot you right out. Don't even worry about that. Again, it ties into their fear of engulfment. The fear and avoidance of being swallowed up by others might be a corollary of the avoidance of relationships. Yet not only this, for it is also the expression of a half-conscious perception of one's own suppressed need to relate, and a fear of potential dependency. Their fear of dependency also comes up in their autonomy. The great sensitivity to interference and interruption of the 5 is not only the expression of a detached attitude, but also a function of their proneness to interrupt themselves in the face of external demands and perceived needs of others, which of course they are deeply sensitive to. Not sensitive in the sense that they pick up on it easily, but sensitive to the fact that they feel it harms them. In other words, a great sensitivity to interference goes hand in hand with over-docility, in virtue of which the individual interferes all too easily with their own spontaneity, preferences, and acting in a way coherent with her needs in the presence of others. So, this character is afraid to be consumed by the outer world because they have a great deep sense of their inner lack. Because of this, they tend to detach from others, and they will always choose to, not always, but often when neurotic, choose to not give over being bonded. This is not a ride or die character, with maybe the exception of the sexual 5 once in a while. But Enneagram 5 is the least ride or die character of all the Ennea types. It's because of their retentiveness. So, when you have a character who is detached relationally, who doesn't want to be involved with others, who's very much in their head and not consumed with the outer world, what is that going to breed? Well, it's going to breed autonomy. The great need for autonomy is an understandable corollary of giving up relationships. Together with developing the distant machinery, the individual needs to be able to do without external supplies. So, as a natural course from his detachment, he ends up being, well, self-sustaining, because he'd rather kind of just do it himself. Because of his tendency to not engage, I suspect that this actually gives birth to feelinglessness. Though I have already alluded to a repression of needs and the suppression of anger in the 5, it seems desirable to group these descriptors along with others in a more generalized trait of feelinglessness, which kind of contrasts it to the Enneagram 4, who is one of the most feeling of all characters. It has to do with the loss of awareness of feelings, and even an interference with the generation of feeling, which results from the avoidance of expression and action. This characteristic makes some individuals indifferent, cold, unempathic, and apathetic. Also, I hate this word, anhedonia might be placed here, through the greater or lesser incapacity to enjoy pleasure. It's a more complex phenomenon. So, another contrast between the 1 and the 5. While the 1 is averse to pleasure, the 5 simply appears to not be able to experience it very well. In this is implicit, however, the fact that pleasure does not rank high in the scale of values of this character. It is postponed for more urgent drives, such as the drive to keep a safe distance from others and the drive for autonomy. Now, due to this desire to not engage, this lack of feeling and pleasure, it's not even an avoidance of pleasure like with the 1, they just don't feel it very strongly. You give birth to the postponement of action. You're going to notice that all of these character traits tie into each other, and he explains this very well. We may say that to act is to invest oneself, to put one's energies into use, which goes against the grain of the retentive orientation of the 5. But more generally, action cannot be considered as separate from interaction. So, when the drive to relate is low, the drive to do is lessened. On the other hand, action requires an enthusiasm for something, a presence of feelings, which is not the case in the apathetic individual. To do is also something like showing oneself in the world, for one's actions manifest one's intentions. One who does will also inhibit his activity. Oh, skipped a line. One who wants to keep his intentions hidden will also inhibit his activity on the grounds and develop, instead of a spontaneous movement and initiative, an excessive restraint. That's key for Enneagram 5, excessive restraint. The characteristic trait of procrastination may be regarded as a hybrid between their negativism and the avoidance of action. Now, here's where the intellectualism comes in. They have a cognitive orientation. The 5 is not only introversive, moving away from relationships, but also typically intellectual. Through a predominantly cognitive orientation, the individual may seek substitute satisfaction, as in the replacement of living through reading. Yet, the symbolic replacement of life is not the only form of expression of intense thinking. Another aspect is the preparation for life, a preparation that is intense to the extent that the individual never feels ready enough. A fear of not being prepared. In the elaboration of perceptions as preparation for inhibited action, the activity of abstraction is particularly striking. 5s lean toward the activity of classification and organization, and not only display a strong attraction toward the process of ordering experience, but tend to dwell in abstractions while at the same time avoiding concreteness. This avoidance of concreteness, in turn, is linked to the type's hiddenness. Only the results of one's perceptions are offered to the world, not its raw material. Related to abstraction and the organization of experience is an interest in science and a curiosity in regard to knowledge. Also, the inhibition of feelings and of action, along with the emphasis of cognition, gives rise to the characteristic of being a mere witness of life. A non-attached yet keen observer of it, who, in this very keenness, seems to be seeking to replace life through its understanding. I am going to go ahead and screenshot that because that is absolutely vital to understanding the 5. Absolutely. What does Sylvia say here? I would say that the E5 is inherently the most introverted of all the types. They are incredibly introspective and detached from the world. Yes. Naranjo even talks about how this is the most introverted type. How are they the most introverted? Well, to contrast against the Enneagram 9, who has defensive extroversion, aka they get involved with the world in order to avoid dealing with inwardness, the 5 does the exact opposite, where he gets over-involved in his own head and his internal world in order to avoid the external world. 5s and 9s are just opposites. They're like different sides, different coins. It's not even, it's insane. And we're actually going to talk about what the 5s do in a second here, their defense mechanism. But I'm going to briefly go over the sense of emptiness. The suppression of feeling and avoidance of life constitutes the avoidance of action, with an objective impoverishment in experience. So this kind of seems to imply that emptiness comes from not participating in life. It's almost as if the sense of contentment and fullness comes from interacting with what is external. Hot take. Identity is not an internal thing. This is why the 4 and the 5 honestly have so much guilt or self-hatred or a lot of internal issues. It's really tough stuff because they're so internally focused, making unfavorable comparisons, constantly measuring their internal resources against that of others or that of against their own standards. The fact is, when you are so internally involved, you will lack contentment. And the lack of contentment is tied to a lack of identity. So logically, I must conclude that identity is something you find externally. It's not something from within. This is actually why the 5 is empty, because he's postponing action. He is relying entirely on himself. He's not engaging with the world because he's afraid of involvement. He's detached. And so the sense of fullness and identity requires, not exclusively, but it does require that you be deeply involved and entrenched in the external world. But that's my Enneagram 1 bias talking. It's probably a mix of both, internal and external. Let's be real. Again, guilty character with a high superego. I'm not going to read this because the superego will make sense of it. The trait of high superego may be regarded as interdependent with guilt. The superego's demanding results in guilt and is a compensatory response to it. Like the 1, the 5 feels driven and demands much out of himself as well as of others. It may be said that the 1 is more externally perfectionistic, whereas the 5 is internally so. Also, the Enneagram 1 holds to a relative identification with his superego, while the latter identifies with the inner underdog. These gummies are just amazing. They were buy one, get one free too. I saved some money. Of course, everything that I've mentioned previously gives birth to their negativism, their wish to not give, their hypersensitivity, because if you're not getting involved in the world, you're not being hurt and depleted by it, you can't build a protective wall, you can't build thick skin. You need to get hurt in order to build thick skin. And because the 5 does not even risk being depleted, he does not risk being hurt, he does not risk being action-oriented, he's hypersensitive. Now, let's go to their defense mechanism, then I'm going to give a brief recap, and then we can be done. Now, this is vitally important. Though it is possible to speak of reaction formation in connection with the superegoic aspect of the 5, the good, the good boy, the good girl, I'm not bad, I'm a good person. It's not actually a reaction formation that predominates the 5, it predominates the 1, but isolation predominates the 5. Now, what he means by this, in the technical sense of the word, is not the behavioral isolation of a schizoid in the social world. Now, that's vitally important as well, because when people hear isolation, they think, oh, I'm going to lock myself away from others. Isolation, Enneagram 5, boom. This is not the case. Let's read a little bit more. There seemed to be some relation between interpersonal isolation and the defense mechanism called isolation in psychoanalysis, i.e., between the interruption of the relationship with others and, here's where it is, an interruption of the relationship with oneself, or with the representation of others in one's inner world. So isolation is actually internal. Anna Freud describes isolation as a condition in which the instinctive drives are separated from their context, while at the same time persists in awareness. Instinctual drives are separated from their context. What does that mean? Well, the situation or the context is torn apart and compartmentalized away from their drive. When speaking of painful traumatic experiences, Matt Blanco says that it can be observed in cases when the intellectual content of what has occurred, so the thinking part, is isolated from the intense emotion of what was experienced. So their thoughts and their feelings do not exist side by side, they are separated. Quote, which is coolly recollected by the patient as if it referred to something that happened to somebody else and does not matter to him. So he dissociates from his own experiences and hyper-intellectualizes it. Intellectual content separated from intense emotion, making it feel like it happened to someone else. In these cases, he adds, it is not only the emotional content that is isolated, but the connection bearing within the intellectual content itself, which results in the loss of the true and deep meaning of the traumatic experience and of the instinctive impulses that have been at play in relation to it. The result of this is then the same as in repression through amnesia. The concept of isolation has been applied to the process of separating experience from the contextual horizon of experience, through the interpolation of a mental vacuum immediately after. Again, it has to do with the fact that this character is very empty when it comes to true experiences of life, and isolation helps with this. So, in order to not be harmed by his own feelings or by the experience of the outer world, he takes three things, in my opinion. He takes not just the mental and emotional and separates them, but the actual events. I imagine the Type 5 mind as being a great deal of compartments and cupboards and wardrobes and all sorts of other things, which he has he'll take one event and he'll take it apart into 6 different pieces and pigeonhole it into little containers, such that when he thinks about his past experiences or his times where he was overwhelmed, he does not consider the experience in whole, but rather small parts of it. Or he might just shut up certain parts forever, like his emotional experiences. The incongruency of aloofness with the ordinary human need for contact is maintained through a dulling of the emotional life, which makes them opposite to the two, which typically dulls the intellectual life, especially the sexual too. At other times, in the more hypersensitive variety of the individual, it exists side by side with intense feelings which appear in greater association with the aesthetic and the abstract than with the interpersonal world. I wonder if that would lead them to be more brought to emotion by art than by people. Also, the avoidance of action in the 5 may be seen in light of an avoidance of feeling and of the isolation mechanism, and would deserve the name of motoric isolation, better than the interruption of thoughts and the disturbance of gestalt perception through mental blocking. I think this mainly has to do with the fact that, and I'm going to wrap it up here, the 5's hypercognitive orientation leads them to have total mental domination over their own experience, such that they actually stop giving themselves an experience. They stop experiencing life and instead say, oh, well, I know what happened. They kind of take their experiences, put it out of themselves, and look at it like this, holding it in their hand, thinking, oh, yes, this thing that I am studying. It's like, no, bro, that happened to you, and it hurt, and you're not dealing with that. That's the 5. But we're going to go ahead, take a look at this. This very shortly will summarize the core type, and next week we can look at the subtypes. The passion of greed is the neurotic need to conserve the little that one feels to have conquered, or the little that one carries in itself. With the existential experience of having lost the original union, the 5 renounces what he does not have, while seeking not to lose what little he has left. As regards the need to feel that he exists and is loved, the 5 distances himself from the need itself and from the other, as the other represents someone who could awaken that need. In order to obtain this renunciation, he is forced to separate himself from his feelings and put his energy into an intellectual passion that he imagines could fill the sense of feeling poor and disinherited. The 5 describes his childhood as a place and time of solitude that goes beyond the events. Relationships always have a formal and effectively aseptic style. The mother, while intrusive and controlling, maintains an emotional distance. She does not facilitate the expression of feelings, she is not empathic, and does not participate in the child's world. Care may not be lacking, but it isn't transmitted through intimate contact, including physical. For the E5, the body, primarily space for the definition of oneself, with its perceptions, impulses, and instincts, ceases very early to be the basis of access to itself. The other and the world and cognitive information becomes the channel preferred for relational exchange and for the construction of one's own identity, leading to an under-involved, inhibited, private character. I'm going to wrap it up here. The 5 appears cold, expressionless, thoughtful, inhibited, suspicious, and physically withdrawn. Within himself, he is not aware of also being a body, just as he is also foreign to the other's body, as if he were walking in a world that does not belong to him.